closing the door, and you're certainly welcome to bring the extra chairs in. I'm not aware of the maximum capacity, and we are live here on Tuesday, February 3rd in House Transportation. It's a big transportation action day today, and we are happy to have some repeat guests and a whole lot of new and familiar faces. So welcome. I hope your day went well. I very much appreciate the reception this morning on my way to the Agency of Transportation meeting I have every week. So the scones were awesome, and the conversation was positive, and I was hearing about some public transit piece up in Franklin County, amongst many other things that you're working on. So I welcome you back to committee, Katie. I don't know if you're ready to start it off, and
Ready.
It's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Walker and members of the committee for having us back. My name is Katie Gallagher. I direct the Sustainable Communities Program with the Vermont Natural Resources Council. But as part of that work, I get to help coordinate the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition, which is what we're here to talk about today. And we've been in this committee before, so really appreciate the time to talk about who we are, who we represent, and our policy priorities for this year. Some of these priorities are the same as what we've been talking about for several years now. Some of them are a little bit more new, but excited to dig in. I'm going to kick off our testimony today, and then we'll be joined by Kelly Stoddard-Ford, who's representing AARP Vermont, to talk more about our policy priority related to funding for public transportation. And then I know that you're going to be hearing from Local Motion after us. And so as partners in the coalition, they're also going to be talking about some of our priorities as well. So with that, just a brief kind of overview of who we are as a coalition. We were founded in 2017, trying to bring together a group of organizations, institutions, individuals, businesses to recognize and acknowledge that transportation poses both a really significant challenge, but also is an opportunity to bring together solutions related to diverse topics like healthcare and the environment and accessibility, affordability. And so what our priorities are really trying to address is this kind of multitude of different ways in which transportation impacts all of our lives. So we have advocacy members, as you can see in the graphic here, representing transit providers, housing, health, environmental organizations, and others. We also have non-advocacy partners who help to advise us on policy and participate in our monthly meetings. And so this is just kind of our public-facing list, but we have many more members who join us on a regular basis. So really what we are trying to achieve here is affordable, healthy communities for all Vermonters, where you can live and work and age in place without having to be forced into dependence on vehicles that can be expensive and polluting and inaccessible. So, just to state the obvious, we're talking about Vermont, a very rural state with dispersed communities. And so that is kind of part and parcel of what we are trying to address, is how do we make a functional transportation system with many transportation options work in such a rural area. So we know that, our communities were built around a time when we didn't have cars, but then over the past several decades, we transitioned to building our communities out in such a way where we really do depend on our vehicles. And so part of what we are trying to do is recognize that there are still many Vermonters who can't drive for one reason or another, don't have access to a vehicle, can't afford one, are disabled, are too young, or don't want to drive for climate and environmental reasons. And so we want to make sure that everybody can get to where they need to go, to, regardless, again, of where they live or their income or their abilities. Well, I don't know why I should show up. This is a beautiful chart we had that is showing not only, just a couple challenges to highlight here, but I know you all are very familiar. Yeah, I don't, but thank you. Yeah. I'm glad you can see it. Transportation is consistently the largest source of our greenhouse gas emissions. we don't need to go too much into it. But it's a big problem related to the climate. It's also a big problem related to affordability. This is a chart that is showing transportation and housing costs put together, looking at urban versus rural Vermont. And the 2 points that I think are really important here. One is that this is one of the largest expenses for Vermont households, especially for rural Vermonters, but also that when we are talking about affordability, we often tend towards just housing and our housing needs and housing affordability, but transportation is a really critical part of that conversation that tends to be left out. I have another chart that is not here, but we have data we could share with you all that's looking at by region or by town. If you put together those housing and transportation costs, you can see that, for example, living in Milton is not actually all that much cheaper or isn't cheaper than living in Burlington when you put together housing and transportation costs, because you might have cheaper housing, but you're paying more in transportation. So it's not only a huge expense and burden, but as we're having this larger conversation around affordability, we really need to make sure that transportation is a part of it. So could keep going and I won't, but just to throw out a couple bigger numbers that I think are just, kind of shocking. One is that we would save over $1 billion in reduced healthcare costs and increased productivity by 2050 if Vermont followed through on our clean transportation recommendations that were made by the state. ARP has this shocking figure that the impact of isolation on older adults is the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So just again, this is, we're talking about energy, we're talking about affordability, access to jobs and services, physical health, health and safety, et cetera. So I know you all know that, but I think it's important to frame this conversation in terms of that urgency and the fact that your committee is dealt this huge hand of transportation, but it's really so much bigger and so much broader. And it's really tough. I don't know why all these pictures aren't showing it, but that's okay. It was a lovely picture. Oh, you have access to it. That is the Waterbury Roundabout.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, love it. So we have all these challenges. We also have significant opportunities. And that's kind of the good news, and part of why this coalition founded to begin with was to say that when we do things like try to reduce our climate emissions from vehicles by increasing walking and biking, that's also good for our physical health. So all these things are really interconnected, which is great. So getting into our first policy priority, and I should say this is not really a specific policy ask, but more just something that we want to highlight again, and I was speaking to it a little bit more earlier, but the impact of land use on our transportation outcomes is huge. And we're in the process right now of implementing Act 181, which was the 2024 law to overhaul Vermont's planning framework. And what that bill is the law is trying to do is to support compact community centers. And when we do that, we are able to not only promote more housing in those areas, but also to facilitate the type of environment that's needed to have transportation infrastructure like sidewalks or transit stops. And so it's a both and. The challenge is, we are dealing with this settlement pattern right now where we have become more dispersed. And so we're trying to invest in the transportation system that needs to meet needs of dispersed rural communities, which means that we literally can't afford to do that and to meet Vermonters' needs. So by trying to bring together transportation into the housing and land use planning conversation, we can help to reduce those costs for the state, for homeowners, for municipalities who are dealing with those maintenance and infrastructure costs, et cetera. So we just really wanted to highlight support for implementation of the law, and also acknowledge that, as with any planning process, this is going to be a long-term iterative process. It's going to be probably messy at points, but we really need to ensure that the transportation voice is at that table to ensure that we are leveraging that process. You know, I threw this chart in here, but it's real wonky, so I don't really want to get into it. So really just want to say we have a goal of reducing the amount that we drive for all of the reasons that we talked about. And this kind of shows the patterns that we can get into. But the next policy priority that we have is setting a target for reducing how much we drive or the vehicle miles traveled VMT. And this is really just about understanding that we have goals. We don't really have great metrics or systems for measuring how well we are doing. There are several different examples of where we aren't really measuring our progress towards certain goals, but this is one that we're focusing on this year because it really kind of relates to a broad array of goals that we are trying to address to get affordable, accessible, and resilient communities. Setting a VMT reduction target is something that a number of other states have now done or are exploring. It looks a little bit different in other states, depending on what they're really trying to address. And so we could talk more about what those details could look like. But what we are looking for is this kind of planning compass. It would be up to the Agency of Transportation. We think it would make sense for them to work in conjunction with ANR, DHCD, VAPTA, transit providers, other stakeholders to come together and figure out exactly what this looks like. There has been a discussion about this type of target in the past, and to my understanding, it didn't really get anywhere. But this would be asking them to adopt a process to develop this kind of clear quantitative statewide per capita VMT reduction target so that we know how our programs and our investments are holding up.
This is an interesting one for me. I think that in the short time I've been in this spot, we've been very welcoming to your groups and your committee, your pieces, and all your partners and the testimony. And one of the reasons we do that is because to hear it over probably helps and continue to hear the argument. I was raised and brought up in the mindset of young man and get your car and explore the world and go wherever you want and have your part-time job and fill that gas tank up and continue to be free and explore. So I come from a very mindset that is exactly the opposite of that stated goal. And it's not the first time that you've been here, and I'm certainly not the only one that probably feels that way. So I think part of the reason that I am as accommodating to the time in the committee is to try to understand and hear what the many views are in this area.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ones that and I like people to know where it stands in terms of what you're up against, in terms of, at least for now, and maybe not in the entire committee, but for me, that's a tough emotional reaction that I've seen multiple times to that. So that was one of the pieces, and then I'll probably make another comment as you get into sort of more of the public transportation and a few other things, particularly on the emphasis between our rural services and our urban services, and our needs to fund them are different. Yeah, and the needs are different, and I struggle very much with one pot of public transportation money that seems two very separate needs between the rural and the urban. So I apologize for interrupting a little bit, but I'm happy to have you keep coming back and helping me understand and work towards that, because that is against an entire lifetime of view. And I hear a lot of nodding and a lot of agreement that it's out there, and that doesn't mean we can't go in that direction. But anyway, that's what and I'm certainly happy to hear any comments, to that of any of yourself and your guests. But that is how I reacted to it before and how I'm reacting to it again, and I want to share.
Probably an age-related thing, like my son has a young millennial would say, he is the total opposite, that freedom is related to not being in the car. So it's shifty.
Oh, I'm sorry, you need to identify yourself before.
Sorry, I'm Bevan.
From
Pekin, Vermont. I'm a bicycle advocate in any pitch.
Okay. And then anybody else who wants to add just needs to identify themselves for the record so we know who spoke.
Thank you. And I think as everybody kind of nodding, like that is, I think how many of us were raised. And so very much appreciate and understand that reaction. And what we are mostly coming from a place of, we don't think that cars, and I want to frame this in the right way, we don't want to be dependent on cars as the only solution, right? Those of us who can drive, it's a great option for independence, especially as we have more electric vehicles. Although my electric vehicle died this morning. But it's how do we accommodate other options as well? And in the VMT reduction sphere, it's how do we, we're investing a lot in electrification, as well as walking, biking, transit to try to reduce emissions, but also for these accessibility and affordability pieces, are those investments actually making a difference? And that's kind of where it's coming from.
And I further would add that it also reacts to me in a limiting factor on economic activity and economic drive and what that does to our overall economy, tax base, people's actions, et cetera. Also, when I hear about a limiting of activity, that concerns me. I need that gas tax right now.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Feel that. And also, I think you're going to hear a little bit more from Local Motion on some of the economic impact, but, it's also worth noting that we know that increasing walking and biking has a positive economic impact on our local communities. And so to the extent that, this in conjunction with what we were just talking about related to land use planning and compact development, the whole goal or part of the goal is economic development, specifically to bring people into our downtowns and to spend money in our downtowns and to get out of their cars and walk from one shop to another, because that's how we build that up. But very much appreciate your thoughts there. Okay, move us along. Man, these all work this morning. That's okay.
An adjustment that you can do or not.
You can images out.
There you go. This is an image of from Energy Action Network. It should be on the slides that I shared, but it's just to show again how these pieces are interconnected. This one looking at electric vehicles reducing our emissions, but it's also an economic issue for vehicle owners. This is one, and I think I did not say in the beginning here, but we are coming to you this session very much in recognition of the budget constraints that you are dealing with and wanting to be respectful and aware that those are real challenges. And so some of these priorities that we have, like electrification, maybe I would say we don't have high hopes for reinstating these incentives this year, but wanted to continue to talk about them as high priorities. The two incentive programs that we highlight in our written testimony is Mileage Smart and the e-bike incentive program, because those are the two most focused on lower income Vermonters, and for the e-bike incentives have been very impactful for those with accessibility needs. So again, these are really important not only for reducing our climate, air, and water pollution, but also to promote access in terms of what people are able to afford to get around. The other priority that we have in this category is related to enacting a statewide right to charge law. I know this has come before your committee in the past. This year, we're looking a little bit more specifically at tailoring that to residents of condo associations or have HOAs. So it's more narrow, but again, it's just trying to ensure that folks have access to charging for electric vehicles, as well as other types of electric micromobility options. The next priority here is kind of more of the big picture funding topic that we talk about every year, which is just we need more money for walking and biking and transit and transportation demand management. So I know that you all have heard us talk about why these investments are important. And again, we understand that there's a lot of competing budget needs this year, but I think at the very least, what we are hoping to see is stabilized funding for transit and for these programs. As we know, especially for grant programs or programs that are impacting employers and consumers, it's really difficult when the funding is kind of going up and down or goes to zero one year and then gets restarted. And so making those programs more reliable and consistent is really, really helpful.
Just a quick question. As you know, the governor proposed clawing money back from the education fund. Has your organization taken a poll on where they stand on that?
We have discussed it. We have not taken an official position as a coalition. I will say the kind of broad sentiment that I've heard from coalition partners is a feeling that it is not a long-term sustainable solution, and that at the very least, we need to be looking towards other sources of funding. And obviously the education fund is also suffering.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that's no, you really haven't. But as far as sustainability, that would be sustainable because we'd be back into our control. So it would be on a permanent basis, but just
Yes.
curious. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm sure that's something that the coalition will continue to discuss.
Sure.
Local Motion and their testimony afterwards is going to talk a little bit more about the specific programs that we are looking for here, but I will note that there's also a little bit of money shifting that we are also proposing related to the Transportation Alternatives Program, but I'll let them talk about that. Okay. This was just a quote that I thought was really impactful that I wanted to share quickly. This was coming from a woman in Newport. We have been trying to reach out to folks just to get their stories and really highlight the needs that we're hearing from folks. And so this is, a senior who is able to walk to get around. She is able to arrange rides with RCT. And that's more than what a lot of Vermonters have access to. And still, she says that it really limits her independence. And so just, again, this has really important on the ground consequences. So our last priority here, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly Stoddard-Poor to talk more about investments in public transportation. I want to just note here about that, one, this has been the coalition's #1 priority for a number of years, recognizing again that budget constraints are kind of the killer. And also wanting to, again, talk about what might those alternatives to the gas tax in our current system be. So we have those studies that have come out over the past long time, 15 plus years, identifying different mechanisms. So I will leave it there. And I'm going to hand it over to Kelly.
What?
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Liz. I just have a question on your previous slide, the Newport quote. Newport have a public transit train years ago? Do you know the history? I just didn't know.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Ken, you're old enough to remember it was there.
Remember it. Yeah, don't remember that.
I will say in my town of Waterbury, right, I live in a historic village center, but it's not the downtown. It's more north. And we have no transportation services or infrastructure right now, but there used to be sidewalks and there used to be an electric wooden rail going behind my house, going up to Morrisville. Neither no longer are there, but yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, what happened to the sidewalks? I don't know. No, and I had to convince a lot of people that it was real because I had gone through the like old photos of our home and found them, and people did not believe me, but they were there.
That's a step backwards.
Yeah. They might be buried. A lot of times they just get buried because the towns have to maintain them. Then money.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Walker, for having me, and to committee members. I'm Kelly Stoddard-Poor with AARP Vermont. I serve as the Associate State Director on behalf of AARP, and I lead our livable community work I've done with AARP since 2013. And my focus is on supporting Vermont communities to be age-friendly and livable communities. So that includes transportation, housing, community support services, and public spaces. As we know, we all are aging and we're living longer, and it's estimated that we will all outlive our driving years anywhere between 7 to 10 years. So, Chair Walker, you bring up a great piece earlier around the independence that we have with our vehicle that it provides us. It's a really important piece of our independence. And so ARP's focus on age-friendly communities is how we can make our communities provide more transportation options as we're getting older so that we can remain independent and contributors to our community. So my focus today is just to really dial in a little bit more on the importance of funding for public transit in particular. It's no surprise to anyone in this committee that we are an aging state in Vermont. We're right now the second oldest state in the country. We kind of swapped places with Maine and New Hampshire, but looking a little bit more specifically about what that looks like. So 30% of our residents are over the age of 60, 42% of our population is over the age of 50, and 20% of our population is over the age of 65. It's estimated that about 66% of Vermonters are living in rural areas in our state, where distances are greater and options for transit are fewer. And for older adults that are no longer driving, people living with a disability, residents without access to a vehicle, whether by income or by choice, public transit isn't a luxury, but a lifeline for them to be able to get to where they need to go. Public transportation is essential for our health, our independence, and the economy. It helps us get to healthcare. It helps us get to food, employment, education, and provide social connectivity. In fiscal year 25, our transit system in Vermont provided over 9,800 trips to adult day centers across the state. So certainly demonstrating the need that helps provide important public health to older Vermonters, independence, and supports our family caregiving network across the state. As Katie shared earlier, transportation is a major household expense. In 2024, Vermont households spent $16,647 per year on transportation, which is higher than our national median. And for people who are living on fixed incomes or modest incomes, if they don't have access to affordable and accessible transportation, that means they could be missing out on employment, missing appointments like doctor's appointments, and also the impact that social isolation can have on individuals who do not have means of getting out of their home. Investing in transit is also makes a strong economic sense. Nationally, it's estimated that every dollar that we invest in public transportation generates about 5-to-1 economic return, creating jobs and supporting local economies. So as you've heard over the course of the last month and previous years, current funding is not keeping pace with the need for public transit. And that is obviously putting a great strain on our transportation budget. And I know that all of you have a really difficult job in front of you budgeting for our transportation needs across the state. In FY25, public transit experienced funding cuts and route reductions that occurred across the state. As federal COVID dollars are drying up and are nearly exhausted, it is really showing a lot of the structural funding issues that we have within our transit system. And currently Vermont is receiving 5.6 million annually in the rural formula operating funds, which is only 1/3 of the amount needed to support rural transportation. The older adults and disability program is experiencing significant costs and demand that is providing transit for Vermonters. So in FY26, VTrans received request at 6.1 million, was funded at 5 million. They were able to come up with the 6.1 million to avoid further reductions. But for FY27, the budget remains at 5 million, knowing that they're going to need at least 6 million to support the older adults and disability program, O&D. And just to put our transit to, obviously, as you're dealing with the entire transportation budget, public transit represents 3% of all our total state transportation funding. So $8.8 million we dedicate to public transit. And so our concern at ARP is that this sort of vicious cycle of service cuts, then we would reduce ridership, which would ultimately undermine local economies, and then we could jeopardize federal dollars, which then would reduce in further cuts to public transit. And so as we look to the future, we look at the need for public transit. As I shared, we're as an aging population, coupled with our state's commitment to supporting aging in place, we're going to see an increase in public transit needs, particularly in rural parts of our state. We have an ongoing epidemic around opioids. So for many people, that requires daily transportation for treatment. Persistent workforce challenges make it difficult for some employees to be able to get to their jobs. And then barriers for low-income rural Vermonters who want to escape poverty, transit can be that lifeline for them. And then our state's overall goals to reduce climate change by reducing the dependence on single occupancy vehicles. So ARP's recommendations as we look forward to the building for the next fiscal year. So stabilizing state operating support for public transit so that we can avoid further cuts and maintain eligibility for our federal funding that the state receives. 2, prioritize rural and demand response services that support older adults and people with disabilities. The third one, explore equitable, sustainable revenue options that the Vermont Public Transportation Association has laid out. They have put a number of different types of funding opportunities to explore: vehicle registration fee, rental car tax, retail delivery fee, mileage-based user fee are some of the things that they have reported out. And then 4th, support innovative mobility programs such as Mobility for All. And then 5th, ensure transparency and accountability for our public transit system. As I shared earlier, public transit is really a lifeline for so many Vermonters, particularly older Vermonters and people living with a disability and those who do not have access to a vehicle. We want to make sure that as a state, we're meeting our goals around age-friendly, livable communities, providing support for workforce participation, and creating communities that are climate resilient as well. And just to kind of summarize too, some of the points that Katie had made earlier, the importance of housing location as we look at the implementation of Act 181 is really important. Where we're locating new housing, it's important that it's connected to services, to amenities, and to our existing transportation infrastructure. And then looking at VMT reduction targets and supporting incentives for e-bikes as well, and making sure that we are building a transportation future that is going to meet the needs of Vermonters. And I know that you have a really difficult task in front of you, given what the outlook for the fiscal outlook for Vermont right now. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share a little bit of AARP's perspective on the importance of transit. I did also, I had shared with Chair Walker, we create some funding fact sheets on closing the gap around public transit. I have a couple of paper copies that I brought with me, but I can also share electronically.
And Gabriella will have it posted to the site, and Representative Couch, have a comment?
Yeah, thanks for coming, and I think last year I mentioned it. Heinsberg's a very busy spot,
Mhm.
116 going through. We have one flashing beacon to get across a crosswalk by AARP.
Yes.
Funding, so I appreciate that, and that's having an impact, because people actually use that, and we have Kelly's Field, the elderly housing across the street, and
Yeah.
they use it. You mentioned O&D and you mentioned some funding. Can you
Mhm.
just repeat those numbers?
Sure, absolutely.
It seemed like it wasn't, far-fetched.
Okay, so the O&D program is obviously experiencing increased demand. So in FY 26, V-Trans received requests at 6.1 million. They had been funded at 5. They ended up coming up with the remaining amount to match it at 6.1 for FY 26. So FY 27, the budget remains at 5 million for O&D, but we know that the last previous year, it was funded at 6.1. So it's about $1 million short for the O&D program. We, just as a side note too, ARP also has some fact sheets on the impacts of the potential impacts to Medicaid as well. So if those are some fact sheets that would be helpful, that are Vermont specific, I can also share that with the committee as well. So, and I do want to just put a quick plug. We are accepting grant applications for our Community Challenge Grant Program. AARP has doubled its investment nationally from $4 million to $8 million. So we'll see more grants being awarded. And the deadline is March 4th. And so we fund community projects across the state. So please share with your community.
Very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And touch base with Jesse before you.
Sit down.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. Good to go. Yeah. Thanks, Chair Walker, for having us back. For the record, I'm Richard Amore, Programs Director with Local Motion. I'm joined with Marcy Gallagher and our Executive Director, Christina Erickson. I appreciate the committee giving us an opportunity to come back. It's nice to see you all again. Thanks to all the committee members. Are you related?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a family affair. I'm going to share a little bit about building off the testimony that you heard from Katie. I know we're a little behind schedule, so I am going to speak fast and go through the slide deck rather quickly and welcome any questions. We were here a few weeks ago, so you know who we are. And we do a lot of work supporting communities across the state, really helping them plan, build, advocate, build that rural capacity in our smaller towns and in growing towns in Chittenden County to really support walking and biking and rolling. And, we shared a video that didn't work. It was a muted video. It was the quietest this committee's probably ever been. But I just wanted to share this quote. This is what we're trying to do. The town of Chester went for a planning grant through the Better Connections.
Oh, yes.
Sorry,
It's like time now.
So the town of Chester, they went through a Better Connection planning process. I know this committee's been a big advocate for that program. I used to work at ACCD and partnered with VTrans to run this program. And it's just, showing how good transportation planning is supposed to work. They apply for a grant, they get a grant to look at transportation, land use, housing, economic development all together. They go through that community-driven process, develop priorities, and then they came to local motion to test those priorities, really to test something out before you actually buy it, really try to help inform a future capital investment, but try something out. And we went and did demonstration project, temporary crosswalks, intersection improvements, a better walkway in the central business district to support commerce. And then they applied for a downtown transportation fund to implement these changes. So they test before they buy, and then they implement with the community support and buy-in behind it. And that's just good government and good planning. And I'm going to go through this rather quickly, but I truly believe if you change the street, you change the world, as we're seeing in Chester and across the state. Communities are using streets more than just moving cars. They're using it for places for commerce, like in Burlington or in St. Johnsbury, to expand their wares and peddle their goods, as well as in St. Albans. All the renovations they did, a revitalization they did to downtown St. Albans started with public investment. They invested in their Main Street, they invested in their Village Green, and then they invested in the buildings around it. And these are what's brought economic transformation to downtown St. Albans. And if you haven't been to St. Albans in about 10 years, it's a big difference than it was 10 years ago.
Not since 7:15 this morning.
And then streets are places for us to connect and enjoy community and build community together, like here in Lindenville or in Northfield, providing opportunities for children to walk to school safely, or places that you enjoy celebration, from Old Home Days to July 4th celebration. They are really the true binding glue in our communities to build community and celebrate and create Halloween memories like this mother and daughter in downtown Waterbury. And I wanted to pull this quote from a good friend up in the Northeast Kingdom, Jillian Sawaki, talking about how streets are really important, and folks who are in community and economic development really need to be creating opportunities for residents, people of different backgrounds and experiences to share space and joy together, to build trust, to build economic opportunity and mobility in their community. And so why complete streets? And I know I was going fast, so I'm gonna look through some of my notes. But when communities invest in safe sidewalks, bike paths, parks, they're not just building infrastructure. They are building places that attract people, businesses, and visitors. And these vibrant, walkable communities really help drive tourism, help retain young families, and bring talent to Vermont. And it's more needed than ever. And good transportation investments should be a focus about economic vitality as well as mobility. And here you can see an example from our Bike Smart program, where we're working to help support kids and learning how to ride to school safely and supporting safe mobility within their village. And it's really about making sure our kids return home from walking to school. Our older Vermonters can walk to our older neighbors can walk to the post office safely when they don't have access to a vehicle or choose not to drive, and really making sure everybody returns home at the end of the day. And there's really no better marketing, economic development tool, tourism draw than investing in vibrant places where people want to live, work. We see it in St. Albans, we've seen it in Brandon, we see it in Burlington, we see it in Montpelier. When you invest in your downtowns and quality public spaces and streets, it drives economic investment. We're seeing this with the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail being an economic engine for the Northeast Kingdom and the communities along the trail, and the potential is huge. There was a study just done in Caledonia County from NVDA looking at the economic potential of the rail trail, and 3 different modeling scenarios, anywhere from $3.9 million to $4.7 million in annual economic impact just in one county along the LVRT. So these transportation investments are driving economic development in the communities that need it the most in our state. And we see it every day in Burlington on the Island Line Trail in the Colchester Causeway. We have over 150,000 unique visitors coming to our state to ride, enjoy the beauty of Lake Champlain, and experience the Colchester Causeway. And over 30 to 50% of these visitors are out-of-state visitors. And what are out-of-state visitors bring? They bring deeper pockets. They support our local economy, on average anywhere from $200 to $300 a day of spending when they come in and just spend the day on the trail. And people from all over the country, all over the world are coming to enjoy the beautiful Island Line Trail and Lake Champlain. This past year, we had 31 countries represented from people renting bikes or taking the ferry across the causeway. Outdoor recreation is 5% of our gross domestic product and a real driver of the rural economies across the state. And it's really about investing in places. And, investing in places is what transportation does. It's usually often the largest investment in a local community is by investing in mobility improvements. And these investments in complete streets, recreational trails, and walkable places, they matter because our investments in places matter. Our communities and our streets matter because our place determines our health, wealth, and happiness more than anything else, more than our genetic code, where we grow up, where we live, the investments in place-based community and economic development that you see is driving health and wealth and happiness outcomes more than our even genetics. And investing in these things pay downturn dividends, especially in rural communities. And as we think about the housing conversation, I really wanted to share to build the housing Vermont needs, we need to invest in both visible infrastructure people experience every day, like sidewalks, safe streets, crossings, and bike routes, and the below ground infrastructure like water and wastewater to make sure the fertile is right to support that new, the soil is right to support that new housing growth. And a lot of that conversation has been about water and wastewater, but we're seeing a lot of housing development, especially in Chittenden County where a lot of that happened, and it's not being thoughtfully planned. And we're expecting this new housing developments to be put in on Shelburne Road, for example. And it's not a place where people feel safe to walk to school. Like we're adding more cars to Route 7, more congestion. We need to think about where and how we invest in infrastructure to support housing, both above and below ground. And the customers are demanding this more than ever. And it's what they are demanding. And this graphic summarizes from the National Association of Realtors Customer Preference Survey that this, the takeaway is clear. People want walkable, connected places. When I was growing up, like you said, Chair Walker, the car was king, right? Automobile was freedom and independence. In a lot of ways, it still is. But that's a changing demographic and a changing, shifting mindset around mobility and independence. And people are demanding walkable places. We lost 1,800 Vermonters last year. Our population is shrinking. Other states are investing in walkable places. Where people want to go is they can choose to go to places that have high quality of life, and investing in walkable bike places, recreational amenities is what we can leverage as our economic asset and compete with other places to recruit new talent, new workforce development, and support our local economy. So I want to highlight these rather quickly because I know we're running out of time. You all heard about our legislative priorities a few weeks ago, and these are about addressing safety gaps in Vermont's transportation system. First, we need to update outdated transportation statutes, like prohibiting parking within 20 feet of a mid-block crossing, as well as treating center turn lanes as no passing zones. We also talked about creating a state task force and doing a deeper dive and study on electric bikes and making sure that task force studies e-bike, e-moto regulations, including battery safety, parking, and path behavior. And then third, we support Burlington's use of traffic enforcement cameras to help address speeding and dangerous driving in the city. And we are in complete alignment with Transportation for Vermonters policy priorities that Katie presented earlier. And I wanted to share a little bit specifically about funding for active transportation and TDM programs. These programs are important and they have made significant investments about keeping essential mobility options for Vermonters across the state. We're asking for level funding for the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Program, the NTI program. Same thing for further investment in the Better Connections program on an annual basis. The Downtown Transportation Fund for $500,000. These are level funding. We're not asking for new money. This is what is existing in the state budget. I want to go through one by one of these and why they matter. Investing in inclusive mobility, transportation demand management is, supporting Vermont's economy, as you've heard, but it's really supporting our aging population who have long travel distances, limited opportunity for transit in rural areas. As we heard from Katie earlier, households are facing rising transportation costs. So we really need to talk about affordability in transportation, not just about housing affordability, but linking housing affordability with transportation affordability. And these are real pinch points in our workforce shortages as well, because they're increasingly becoming transportation constrained. And we cannot meet our safety, mobility, or climate goals through just roadway expansion and maintenance alone. The MTI program has been a great program since 2020 to really focus on expanding mobility and for transit-dependent Vermonters. We'd like to see double down on the MPI program to serve our most vulnerable neighbors. You know, nearly 30% of Vermonters do not drive, either by choice, by disability, by age. And we need to provide that extra capacity to our small towns to support and advance this work locally, provide transit providers flexible ways and testing new innovations. That's right, Robert.
Richard, I'm gonna bump the next presenters a few minutes so you can breathe while you're presenting.
I'm a Southern guy who is Italian, can talk so fast.
I'm gonna get you a few extra minutes.
Thank you for that. That's all like an auctioneer a little bit. Appreciate
There
that.
might be some questions or some comments from a couple that are afraid to ask, because I've already asked to bump the next for a few minutes, so.
I appreciate the extra time, but it probably won't, slow me down. So the MPI program is a great program. In the past, since it started in 2020, it has funded bicycle and pedestrian and transportation demand manager programs. This year, given the budget shortfall with transit, most of that money or all that money went to transit providers, which I completely understand and respect. But that leaves a gap in the bicycle and pedestrian space. And we see this as a program as a way to test new ideas, to address the real rural capacity challenges. These programs provide that extra horsepower to communities who need that capacity building that support towns that only have a town clerk, right? They're not having the grant writing support, the capacity building that this program can provide organizations to support those local communities. The Better Connections program, I'm a big fan of this program. I worked on it for 10 years and seeing the real impacts of it. I don't know if there's a better planning grant program at the state that drives planning, looking at transportation planning, economic development, water quality, and land use all together, and looking at it in a cohesive way to ensure that our housing and new development is getting built to inform future transportation investments, and really aligning transportation planning with these goals, and really preventing costly mistakes by integrating planning early. And it's really supporting stronger downtowns and village centers like we saw in Chester, or we see in Springfield, or even in St. Albans. Good planning informs capital investments to invest in public infrastructure that drives community investment, that drives economic development and private investment. When the public makes good investments like you see in St. Albans, the private investment follows, and that's what we need to see, the churning of our local economies. And that's what this program is really about, supporting a community-driven vision to inform capital investments and make our communities better places to live, walk, and roll. This is just a good quote from Jason Rasmussen, head of Mountain Scotland Regional Commission, just talking about how important the Better Connections plan to really drive a community-driven process and build consensus, and having those conversations locally to support and inform future capital investments in active transportation. The Downtown Transportation Fund, these are small transportation investments in downtowns that deliver big results, like enhancing safety, lighting, sidewalk improvements, bike lanes, and these are supporting local businesses and strengthening community life in our downtowns. In 2025, the program had an infusion of extra cash, and we supported the Agency of Commerce supported $1.4 million in investments to 8 downtowns and villages across the state. And since the program has launched in '99, there's been over $17 million of state transportation dollars. And when I say state transportation dollars, you all know what that means. It's nimble, flexible, easy money, cost-effective money. You can build 3 times the amount of sidewalk with state dollars than you can build with federal dollars, and build it 3 times quicker, right? And so the Downtown Transportation Fund is a key tool for supporting our downtowns and villages with transportation improvements that improve quality of life. And then our bicycle,
Know much about the demand, the requests for that project versus what was awarded?
So there was a $5 million one-time infusion with ARPA funding for the Downtown Transportation Fund that expanded that program to open it up to village centers who went through the Better Connections program, which has been really impactful. That's how Chester got the Downtown Transportation Fund, because normally it only supports our designated downtown, Barry, Montpelier, St. Albans. But with that $5 million infusion, you all opened it up to a bigger window of availability. That $5 million has been spent. Last year, we gave out, the Agency of Commerce gave out $1.4 million. When I say we, I worked for the agency for 12 years, so it's really hard to let go of that. I'm still a recovering state worker. $1.4 million went out through the agency last year. This year, it's going back to what it historically has been, around $550,000. So that tells you we had 3 times getting funded last year compared to only the $500,000 that we're going to have this year to give out. Historically, just when I was at the agency and reviewing these grants, we tend to get 2 to 3 times the ask because everybody wants that state money, right? It's flexible, it's cheaper, it's quicker, easier to implement and get changes on the ground quicker compared to federal money.
Wow, that's pretty positive, encouraging about state money and activity compared to what we hear regularly.
And this is coming,
Especially then the federal money that we're always trying to leverage, always, they say it comes with huge strings.
and this is coming from, in my role at the state, I serve villages and I've been to 150 select board meetings, supporting them all, getting designated village centers in Swanton, Franklin, everywhere across the state from Canaan to Guilford. And the concerns I hear at every one of those communities I've experienced, safety, slow down traffic in our villages. How can our kids walk to school? And these are the things that I'm hearing. First thing, like we got historic buildings that need fixing up and all, there was some of that, but it always came back to traffic, safety, and really looking at the transportation infrastructure in our villages. And the downtown transportation fund, especially when it was opened up to the villages, was a great tool to do that. Personally, I'd love to see more of that. We're not advocating for that during this fiscal year. We're advocating for level funding. But that $5 million one-time infusion was amazing to see the change that brought on the ground to communities across the state, especially our rural villages from Island Pond to Chester that normally wouldn't get access to these types of funds. Another program that is federally funded is the bicycle and pedestrian program through VTrans. Annually, it gets around $6 million. We're advocating for that continued level funding. But these grants do more than fund sidewalks or bike lanes. They give towns the tools to actually implement their plans and visions, targeting improvements that matter most, and expands mobility for Vermonters who can't drive. And part of these grants, you all know, there is a small scale program within the bicycle and pedestrian program that is state dollars. And these are flexible grants that are putting money out quickly, getting real results people can see in their communities. And for just $6 million a year, we can really make a huge difference in safety, access, and the quality of daily life for Vermonters. And this one is going to take a little bit more conversation, but the U.S. Congress created the Transportation Alternative Program. We get that money from Federal Highway to support walking and biking infrastructure. It was very clear in its purpose when it was created to help people walk, bike, and safely reach everyday destinations. But in Vermont, over time, we've gradually stretched that purpose. Today, over half of TAP funding, Transportation Alternative Program, go to support environmental mitigation projects. I get it. When it changed, what was happening, it was in 2017. Clean water was all the talk of the State House. I was down here back then. We got to address the clean water crisis, TDML, Lake Champlain. Those are still real priorities today. I'm not going to minimize those concerns and environmental considerations. But we also have different priorities today than we did in 2017. And so there was state change to statute to allow 50% of the TAP funding to go to support culverts, environmental mitigation, salt sheds. There's other funding in state governments, millions of dollars of clean water funding from DEC and ANR that support these types of projects. VTrans has environmental mitigation funding. Other way, it seems wrong to be taking money from a program that's purpose was to support transportation alternatives for bicycle and pedestrian improvements, safe routes to school work, to be supporting other priorities that aren't really aligned with the true purpose of this program. We are advocating, I'll also say in 2017, the federal government was giving funding to the state to support safe routes to school work. That money has been cut. There's no more funding going to safe routes to school. And it's creating a gap for our youngest Vermonters and our families trying to get to school safely. We can fix this. We can cap environmental mitigation projects at an 80-20 match, where 20% goes to environmental mitigation, 80% goes for bicycle and pedestrian funding, safe routes to school, planning and scoping, and really make these investments to provide dedicated, sustainable safe routes to school funding. Since the feds cut that funding off, the program has pretty much been dormant. As Christina shared earlier in Senate Transportation today, we do a little bit of safe routes to school work in Chittenden County, funded through the NPO or CCRPC, because they have federal money and they want to prioritize those investments. We support 4 communities right now with task forces in Chittenden County We used to have a very robust program working with regional coordinators, folks, some in this room, to support Safe Routes to School work. And as part of the conversation around education and regionalization of schools, it's more important than ever that we make sure we make investments for our younger neighbors to be able to walk and bike to school safely. So we're asking a shift in the environmental mitigation funding to go down to 20% and 80% funding for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. This isn't just policy changes. This is about making our community safe for kids, older Vermonters, and all of us who want to move around our communities safely.
Clarification on your shifting of the 80-20. Are you, I mean, obviously there's broad things that can get funded through that program. Are you now saying that it's just, you know, like ed and, you know, environmental mitigation? Like,
So the way
so you're really holding it down to two things. So you can't do, I mean, there have been other projects outside of, you know, whether it's sidewalks or salamander crossings or whatever. So you're eliminating all of that.
No, I'm not limiting all that. All that would still be, those are federally
Yes.
kind of umbrellas of what you can find.
Yeah,
Vermont has taken a stand where, unlike many states across the country, said we're going to put 50%, maximum 50%. So every project that comes in for environmental mitigation will get funded.
well, I
Up to
understand.
50% of the
what
fund.
your proposal is.
Our proposal is to basically keep the same way it works, but change it to 80-20.
Okay,
Where 80% is going first. If there's not an 80% demand, of course, you could shift that to environmental mitigation, but shifting that back to its true intent and being really aligned with most of the other states across the country that, you know, the Federal Highway Administration allows environmental mitigation, doesn't mean half the funding should go to environmental mitigation.
no, I concur with you, and I actually changed those funding. I just wondered what your proposal was. It sounded like it was just for that.
No, not at all. But the funding also supports planning and scoping.
Yeah, exactly.
And all that stuff, which you have to do first before you can tap into the grants to make the infrastructure investments happen. We need to continue investing in that upstream work to support the downstream implementation outcomes. So I know we're kind of running out of time. Safe Routes to School work, I think I've kind of, shared why it's important. And it's really disheartening to see, 50 years ago, people used to walk to school, kids used to walk to school a lot. Today, that number is shrinking and lacking, really kids are losing their independence and mobility and freedom and opportunity. And that's disheartening. As a father who lives in Montpelier and lives very walkable to school, I still walk my kids to school because I'm terrified of them crossing Main Street and people speeding down the hill, going to the Main Street Middle School. And it shouldn't be that way, especially where we have our schools located. And it's more important than ever as we talk about regionalization of our school system. Kind of end on a positive note. A great street should be the most desirable place to be, to spend time, to live, to play, to work. At the same time, markedly contribute to what a community should be. Streets are the setting that bring people together. We saw that earlier in all the photos. Streets build community, including back in 1886 in the Winter Carnival on Main Street, the toboggan sledding hill. Thank you for your time. Welcome any questions, and sorry for the quick talking.
I just have to say that the picture of the cows on Main Street was from our Story of the Heifers. That unfortunately went on for a number of years and and it was just a fabulous event. And talk about bringing, thousands of people came to Brattleboro to see that. Anyway.
Representative White?
And thank you very much for this. And I just want to share an anecdote from my community, where last week an elementary school child was walking to school to face an elementary school. There are no sidewalks there. And the child was stopped by a driver of a car. And there was a very, I guess, worrisome interaction. The child did get to school safely, but it was a matter of there's no safe place for kids to walk, to this particular school. And, luckily nothing happened, but just we need sidewalks for kids to walk to school. And I think, we're facing education reform, so there's probably going to be some consolidation of schools. So we don't want to be investing money in schools that are not going to be around. But I think we know that sidewalks for kids to walk to school is good, not only for mobility options, but also for health. And Chair Walker was talking about, how we grew up in a car society, but we also are seeing obesity rise dramatically in our country because we rely so much on cars. So we know just, I'm just preaching to the choir, but I'm just in agreement with these ideas and these funding recommendations.
Marcia Gardner, for the record, I really love that point. Richard had said earlier, 30% of Vermonters don't drive. That includes kids. Kids' independence matters a lot as well. And while we all grew up with, waiting to get our driver's license, I also imagine many more of you grew up being able to ride your bike around than kids currently can. And that really impacts the way that kids form independence and ability to engage in the world as they grow up. So everyone's independence matters a lot, and we do need to be thinking about those 30% of Vermonters, young, old, and in between, who need to walk and bike to get around.
We need to do better by our children.
Representative Lau?
Yeah, two things. First thing is sort of a depressing thing. Last week, we heard on the floor of the House a data point that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, I think it was something like a quarter to 1/3 of our high school students apparently suffer from mental health problems now. And I think this touches this lack of agency. Personal agency is probably has a great deal to do with that. The other kind of more happier idea that I wanted to just draw folks' attention to, you're showing, this historic carnival event there in your slide. And I'm looking at the fact that the outdoor recreation folks are going to be coming to talk to us later this week. And, this is the Vermont brand. People think that we have these wonderful traditional historic villages and they're walkable and really great stuff happens in them. And you can go get coffee and you can, they have events like people chasing cows or whatever this is. And, this is what people think is in Vermont. And, I think, there's a reality check here. That's actually not what is able to happen right now. So I think there's a lot to think about here.
Thanks, Rep. Ollie. it is our value proposition. I used to share this a lot in House Commerce, the agency, is our value propositions are downtowns and our villages and our recreational and natural resources. That's why people come to Vermont, and we need to make sure we invest in those as they pay dividends to us for now and future generations.
Yeah, I'll just sort of, we're close to age, although I think I'm older, and certainly within a week of turning 16, even though I was in a walkable community, walked to school for 7 years, wanted a car because that's what I needed to do. I'll point out my 3 kids, 4, they didn't get their license till 18. My youngest never wanted a car, never got a car. It is a generational difference. And a whole generation is really missing this walking to school, riding their bike to their friends, bringing my fishing pole on my bike. All that sort of disappeared, and people wanted to be safer. And these are the programs I think that work. And I'll say in our town, we've started to add more sidewalks, and I see more kids walking to school. And we, a few years ago, said, well, we need a policy on how we plow the sidewalks, like how deep should the snow be before you plow it, and all that. And so we're looking at updating our policy, and the select board meeting was packed with people, parents, saying, are you changing? You're not going to plow they were concerned about the few sidewalks that we have that get their kids to school, that we were going to change something. We weren't, but it just was reinforcing that people were moving to our town, partly because they can walk their kids to school, walk to the store, get around. So it is a generational shift that has happened or is happening. And it's important that we recognize that.
I can't help myself. I got to throw it out there. There's some substantial there's great work in this. There's also substantial other societal changes that have happened. You cannot drive past any graded school or middle school and even high schools in this state without a huge queue of pickup and drop off. That is not entirely necessary because of no sidewalks and no bike paths. We've got some amazing bike paths and projects, and you've done some great work, but these programs themselves aren't going to fix entirely that issue of that massive queue of cars in every single school picking up and dropping off. Even the ones that are right in the middle of downtowns still have a huge queue of people picking up and dropping off. And that's got something more to do with something else than whether or not entirely they have bicycles. So I wouldn't have you back in here on a regular basis if I didn't think that there's great work doing. And you mentioned multiple towns, from Brandon, where I grew up, that is a beautiful downtown, to what St. Albans has gone through, where I spend most of my time in terms of work and daytime now. So they do help and they can be done. But there is a lot of other pieces that certainly have come to it. And I am, if some of these safe routes to school could help cut down on those massive amount of queues at every school, you would certainly get my support if there's some way to do that. And that I find very frustrating, especially when you talk about emissions as they sit there and idle for so long waiting to pick up. But I'm not going to solve that here, but I'm certainly willing to recognize some of the other guests if you'd like to identify yourself and make a comment.
Yeah, my name is Jacopo. I represent Vital Communities in the Upper Valley. I worked on Safe Routes to School funding for a number of years in state and out of state. And I can say that part of the work that they do does help with the program, the issues that you just brought up. Education at an early age goes a long way. It goes home with the families. So it can target car lines and dependence on car to get to school in many ways, especially in the long term, educating at a young age.
Yeah, I'll share a personal anecdote. I specifically purchased the house within 3 blocks of the middle and elementary school, so I wouldn't have to be in queues and spend my time. Not because I'm trying to save the world, because I don't want to spend my time. So I do want to save the world, but it's really important that it's a lifestyle choice and quality of life improvement when we give kids the freedom to walk to school, not only for themselves, but for parents too.
I certainly agree. Marcy was on the list. I don't know if are we all to the end of our presentation? Okay, I'll throw out one more thing at you. The amount of, totally a little different direction. The creativity to look at the landscape, to look at the streetscape in particular, for the amount of different groups that you have. Sometime in that brainstorming piece, we have incredible infrastructure of state-owned land that goes from top to bottom and north to south and east to west, all along our interstate. And all we do, critically important, is move vehicles. We don't do anything else in that entire streetscape. If you could really boil it down, they call them northbound and southbound barrels. But we have a massive, the Agency of Transportation is the second largest property owner in the entire state after state forests. They have a massive amount of land that goes from the very southern tip to the northern tip, and all we use it for is to move vehicles. So somewhere in the amount of creativities, the amount of work that you guys do, and I'm not to get you off your topic, think about that and come back when you come back next year, and we're all still here or not. Somewhere there's in those creative minds, there's some idea that we should be doing more than what we do with that huge opportunity. So, but thank you for the rest of the time. I will apologize to the next guests on your behalf, or the next witnesses, for being late. And